You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. It's Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, bringing you another episode of The Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the Grand Solar Minimum. On the air with us tonight live is Lee Wheelbarger, subject matter expert, military electronic systems. Now, he recently, him and his wife, hopped onto the electric Blue Solar Yacht, I believe, and he is currently there. Lee, are you on the yacht? Am I making stuff up?
No, sir. I'm actually sitting in the yacht as we speak.
How is it?
It's great. I mean, we're still dealing with some hurricane damage from Hurricane Irma. We lost about half of our solar array, but considering that a tornado touched down here in the marina and pitched other boats on tops of other boats and tore down 17 trees, we're doing pretty good for, only losing half of a solar array and one hatch.
And what was that, from debris hitting it?
No, it actually ripped it off. It pulled when the hurricane was coming through and the tornado went across the top of the marina, it actually, the eye wall went right across the boats right next to our yacht and picked one up and sat it on top of another boat and banged them around and damaged 4 fairly significantly, and picked up the small building that's behind our boat and flung it out towards the middle of the marina and sucked the solar panels right up out of the frames. So is that the panels, the frames themselves are still there, but the panels are gone, ripped all the wires out and everything on half the array. So it was a lot of glass and a lot of cleanup, but we've got it cleaned up and we're starting to replace those panels now.
So you needed new racking and some new panels.
Actually, the framework that we installed onto the vessel sustained everything just fine. There's absolutely no damage to the racking whatsoever. The only damage is to the frame of the individual solar panel itself. They stayed on the frame, and it actually sucked the panel out of the frame of the solar panel. So you can look up and still see all the frames and everything are still there. Just the glass panel wafer material in the middle and all the wiring harnesses are gone.
So now I have my whole solar arrays are still sitting in cases around the yard. I have Iron Ridge racking. Did you have a particular brand name of type racking?
No, as long as it's an extruded aluminum, the racking that I use has a groove in the top, and it allows you to put a bolt into the end of the groove, and the bolt sticks up out of the top, and then you can put brackets on over top of that. Now, because I'm going to be on the ocean and I've got to deal with heavy winds and heavy seas, and I've got a substantial array up there, my panels are 84 by 42 inches. So what we're doing is we're putting them all onto the racking itself, and then everything is being stuck together. All the frames themselves are being adhered together, then they're being riveted together, and then the frames are actually being tack welded to the truss system that we have, which is a combination of 3 20-foot long 4x4s that are treated in epoxy, and then over those 4x4s we have a 1/4 inch thick C-channel that's lag bolt down into that, and that goes horizontally across the vessel, and then longitudinally above that is where we have our track system that the panels themselves sit on, and the bolts come up to clamp it down on the inside. So the bolts come up, we have clamps that come over the inside of the frame and hold them down, and then on top of that they're tack welded on, and that's how we were able to sustain winds of excess of 134 to 167 miles an hour is what we recorded here when the tornado came through during the Hurricane Irma.
Now, are we going to be getting pictures of the rebuild? How are you going to work your Patreon? How are you going to update the Facebook page? Are you going to include, photo arrays, or how's it going to work?
Well, we have a Facebook page right now that has just shown the since I purchased it and started the project, and the equipment that's been donated and put onto the vessel to show in the showcase that we're building. And so we're going to continue on to show the technology on our Facebook page. The Patreon will start getting some videos from the vessel as we start, getting some followers on Patreon. We'll start producing some videos and doing some live streaming from that, because the goal of this is to, once we've completed the vessel, to take it out and do our sea trials with the new drive systems and the azipods and all the motors and the solar panels and the battery banks. And, what we're trying to do is to produce a vessel that is completely, as far as the power, propulsion, and so on and so forth, is EMP and CME protected, if at all possible. That's the end goal, and to have a vessel that is viable for being able to travel on in a somewhat luxurious fashion and be able to do it completely on solar and not use any fossil fuels, not pollute, and have something that will last for years and years. The goal is to have a vessel that will operate for 10 years, basically continuously, without any type of overhaul, including that of the batteries. So once we complete the sea trials in the spring, we'll head north. We're going to do 6,000 miles around the Great Loop. So we'll go up the east coast of the United States, go up through New York Harbor. We're stopping in Washington, D.C., Boston, New York, and I've got VIPs from each one of these cities that that does solar energy or what have you, that want to come and get on the vessel. And so we'll be on display at all of these major cities. Then we're going to continue up through the Hudson River to Albany, New York, go across the C&O Canal all the way over to the Great Lakes, work our way through there, come down through Chicago with stops there, come down the Illinois Canal to the Mississippi River, be on it for a short duration, and then get onto the Ohio River, jump back up onto the Kentucky River, go down through the Kentucky Lakes where Al Gore has his boat, and then continue down the Tom Bigby Waterway to Mobile, Alabama, and then continue back down around the west side of the west coast of Florida. And upon completing that, we will be the first 100% solar-powered vessel to ever complete the loop in a single voyage, just by taking off, doing the entire loop, and coming around. And so we'll be able to transmit video from the boat. We have a heads-up display or an on-screen display that shows the attitude of the vessel, the speed, the voltages of the motors, the wattage. Everything that we're doing is on that screen, and then we'll be able to chat with people. And then I've designed a panoramic vision system that allows people to see 360 degrees around the vessel in the dark at night. And we've got forward-looking sonar. And then we have a downward-looking sonar and 2 side-scan sonars, and we can feed all of that video as well into our live stream, as well as our chart plotter with the radar overlay. And we use a 4G radar, so we have a lot better resolution to the images that we see with that. So we want to be able to stream all that and educate people about what solar power is, what you can do with solar power, and having a viable system that will be able to survive the coming cataclysms of whether it be EMP, CME, or what have you.
Now, you charted all this out, your flight plan, so to speak. What is the hypothetical time frame to do that entire loop from start to finish?
Well, if we push it, we can do it in under 6 months, and if we do it lackadaisically, we can do it in about 8 months. The goal is to be at the upper Yucatan Peninsula on the summer solstice. And so as long as you have made it to the upper Yucatan Peninsula by the summer solstice or thereabouts, or a little bit before, you're good to go. But if you get going across, you're at a northern latitude, you don't get the same amount of energy as you do at a southern latitude. And along that area, you can get some cloudy weather up there. So we've set up the vessel to be able to operate for several days at a lower, reduced speed, so that we continue to make way even under completely cloudy conditions. In fact, if the batteries are fully charged, and we're a little conservative about running all the air conditioners, ice makers, water makers, and all that other stuff, if we know we've got to go a long stretch and we have no solar panels at all, we can actually go about 300 nautical miles on a single charge. So that gives you a pretty good amount of time to get another charge. And then when you've got basically 10 kW array overhead that you can bring into that bank, pull your power back and charge the bank up again, and then go again all night long while running the air conditioners and the ice makers and so on and so forth. And that's the advantage of doing it in a trimaran. You have the lateral space. The beam of the vessel is so much wider. You can put more solar panels on to collect more energy, because when you look at a liveaboard vessel, you have what's called your overhead for all of the regular loads that are on the vessel: the air conditioning, the refrigeration, the washer and dryer, the water maker, the ice maker, the bilge pumps, the communication systems, the radar. All of those are always basically constant loads anytime the vessel is in operation. So you have to be able to cover all of that. Then above that, you have to be able to produce enough power to propel the vessel through the water. And so that's your extra. Or so you've got to have another array basically the same size as the first array to cover your overhead, and that'll produce enough power for you to cover all of your overhead easily, as well as have plenty of power to put into the batteries. Now, this is a sailboat, so whole speed on it is only about 6 miles an hour. So, if you want to run 6 miles an hour, then you're using a substantial amount of power. But each time you decrease by about a knot, you are actually cutting the power consumption of the vessel in half, and that's the advantage of a trimaran and a displacement hull. So if we want to go farther, we just pull back the speed. So if you want to go all day and not operate at night, then you can operate at 6 knots all day if it's a sunny day, because you're pulling off the battery some and you're operating off the solar array. If you want to operate through the night, then all you have to do is pull back to like 5 knots or 4 knots, and then you'll have plenty of power to operate everything through the night, including making dinner with electricity and still all the ice makers and water makers and HVAC system, as well as the security for the radio.
Man, you keep saying ice makers. Scott McDonough is probably just salivating at the bit. I mean, that's his big thing. He would definitely be on your yacht. It sounds like you have a lot of ice makers.
Well, yeah, my wife loves ice, and I like ice cold drinks, and so the ice maker is we're in southern Florida working on a vessel, so cold drinks and ice maker, that thing is the number one used piece of equipment on the vessel.
Yeah, baby.
Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I just said, yeah, baby. Plenty of ice.
So, Lee, what happens when you get frozen in the Great Lakes? It sounds like you'll be up there in the winter.
No, we'll be up there in the summertime, and then we'll work our way south. So, yeah, I have no intentions of being in the Great Lakes, anytime after August. So we'll definitely be out of the Chicago area by then. So, like I said, we'll start working our way up as it gets warmer. We'll keep working our way up the coast, stopping at major cities and other areas along the way. And
so this is starting next year.
Yeah, this coming spring is when we'll do that.
Okay. I thought you were out in the water and headed our way.
No, not yet. We will be splashing at the end of this month. We've upgraded the motors and upgraded the motor drives and done some work to the yamas to basically make the vessel more of a tank. We've added foam into the hulls and a lot of foam into the bow and bigger pumps for the bilges and so on and so forth, because I don't want to have a safety vessel that I can jump onto. I want one that if you run into me, you're going to sink, and I'm just going to sit here and go, hey, give me your hand, I'll help you up. That's the kind of boat I want. So we've built a lot of things into the hull. We've reinforced it, put more layers of fiberglass in, put in, basically yards and yards, cubic yards of flotation foam to prevent the vessel from being able to sink, even if we are struck. So, we wanted a vessel that is, worthy to go anywhere in the world that we so choose, and we've went to the extra effort to put in all these additional safety features.
It sounds awesome, and you have 6 or 8 months to continue to drum up support for your mission before you even set sail, which would be like April-ish. Is that what I'm gathering?
Yeah, we would actually probably be heading north before that. We would probably start, inching our way up Florida probably in around March, and getting to April, we'd surely be into Georgia by then, I would think.
Okay, sounds awesome. Is there anything you wanted to talk about before we get to my topics?
No, sir. I'm good to go with whatever you want to discuss this evening, as usual.
Anything else on the Solar Blue Yacht project?
Not really. We're just going to keep doing updates on it. Like I said, we'll have a YouTube page for it. And, once we get some Patreons that are supporting the channel, we'll start producing more videos, and we'll have some events here and there along the way. So people will actually be able to come by and visit on the vessel.
Well, have you set up the Patreon then?
Yeah, the Patreon is set up. We just set it up the other day. It's Electric Blue Solar Yacht on Patreon. Don't have any followers yet, but of course nobody knows about it because we just did it.
Well, you'll certainly get a bunch of people looking at it from the rebroadcast of this radio show. So we'll have a link below to Lee's Patreon. Become the first Patreon of the Electric Blue Solar Yacht. That sounds awesome. I'm definitely going to get involved there. Now, there's a lot to talk about in the news. Let's quick talk about the headline, which is the collapsing bridge in Italy. And you contacted me and gave me some information, and I found some information from Italian sources that there was lightning that struck the center column. Now, there were two spans that collapsed, as well as the center column. And interestingly enough, an engineer emailed me today to tell me that he actually worked on a project where they were purposefully electrocuting steel reinforced concrete columns, and they were exploding. Very dangerous. So since that bridge collapsed, what we have learned is that it is very old. It's been crumbling, and it was in dire need of repairs, and then like a cocktail, a recipe for destruction. There were high winds, heavy rains, a positive lightning strike in the central column could have caused the central column to blow off the outer shell of concrete, causing the whole bridge to fail. It has not been confirmed, but it is possible. What say you, Lee?
Yes, and that's exactly what I was saying and what I've been talking about for a number of years with the increase in positive lightning strikes and the additional energies that a positive lightning strike possesses. With a regular negative lightning strike onto an electrical grid, you may lose a telephone pole. Worst case scenario in 30 years around the Tampa area, the worst they had ever seen was 2 telephone poles from a single strike, and one of the senior line foreman for the power company FPL had said that he had heard of 3 telephone poles being damaged by a single strike. Here recently, in the last 2 years, the number of poles being damaged by single lightning strikes is going up, and the record to date is now 5 telephone poles with the tops blown out of them from a single strike of lightning. So there's a lot more energy coming down. This energy is much more detrimental to the infrastructure that it impacts upon, and lightning also contains some of the exact same, how should we say, wave patterns of an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. So we are going to continue to see, as we have a more highly energized atmosphere and ionosphere from more particles streaming out of the coronal hole streams, as they come in, we're going to have more energy. More of these positive lightning strikes are going to be coming down. They're going to be more highly charged. Now, in this particular case, you say, well, how could this happen, Lee? Well, it's very simple. If you have rebar or steel or any other conductor that makes its way down through that column, even a pipe containing water, if that is highly energized by that positive lightning bolt, which will be putting thousands of amps instantaneously and volts down through that conductor, any water that is on that will instantly turn to superheated steam, which will expand by 1,600 times, which will blast out the rocks and whatever else that column is made of, whether it be concrete, just like it does to blowing the bark off of a tree. And so you only have to blow away part of that structure to allow the roadway to give a little bit. And once it starts to give, when it catches on the next fixture, whatever that may be, or supporting element, that additional inertia of that bridge falling, plus there's vehicles that are on it, the bridge is covered by water, and like you said, it's in poor repair. It was actually 51 years old. And so if all of this happens simultaneously, that is one of many things that could have contributed or caused the collapse of this bridge. I only point that out because there were witnesses that said that at the exact same time the lightning struck the bridge was when the tower collapsed. And so people ask me, Lee, how is that possible? And that is how it is possible, by rupturing and creating what's referred to as a BLEVE, a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, by the ionization of that water moisture within the column that may have leaked down in it because of the number of years. And of course, if you've got a heavy storm and the wind is blowing and it's blowing from all different directions, there's going to be water working its way in there in a variety of different fashions that could easily make its way down within that column. And additionally, it doesn't necessarily have to be an electrical conduit like a piece of rebar or steel going down through the tower. It's just simply the electrical pathway of water migrating through the tower itself, and in the instantaneous ionization of that. Now, they should be able to, if they do the reconstruction and so on and so forth, and I'm sure there are other cameras that captured this because of where it is. When they do all that, they may be able to say, oh yeah, it did blow out here because look at the way the fracturing of these large chunks of rock or tower came apart. So, they may be able to forensically determine what that is, but that will be some time before they do that. I would expect years.
Yeah, it was absolutely a crazy event. Now, what about the flooding up in New England? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's to be expected, because when you look at the weather patterns associated with the grand solar minimum, you will see that there is a trough that goes across the central part of the United States and goes up into the northeastern region. And because we haven't cooled so much yet, we still have a decent amount of evaporation and moisture in the atmosphere. So as the particles are coming in, we're going to see more rain in that region. Now, as we progress further into the grand solar minimum, the amount of precipitation annually will decrease by about 80%, but the amount of rain you get per rainfall event will be significantly more and will come in the form of a deluge or an atmospheric compression event, as opposed to a nice little drizzle that you need for your, famished crops.
Yeah, the water's going to run right by them, water the top millimeter of soil, and they'll be dry in a day.
Yeah, if it's South Florida, it'll be a half an hour.
And now, is that where your boat is in South Florida? Are you on the intercoastal?
Yeah, we're actually between Lake Okeechobee and Fort Myers right now. And so when we leave here, we're going to move across Lake Okeechobee over to the Stewart area, the Indian River area, and start doing some sea trials there, both on the Indian River area as well as out to sea there in the Atlantic zone.
Can you still hear me, Lee?
Yeah, did you not hear me?
Yeah, no, I think I had a call coming into my phone here, so there was a lot of weird beeping. Now, you had contacted me earlier about some information. We're talking about the Grand Solar Minimum. Our channel, the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, we started the channel to document the changes as we descend into the Grand Solar Minimum. And I posted on my Facebook page last night a chart that I had made up of all of the minimums. And it goes back 1,000 years, and it shows you the duration. Now, the duration of these grand minimas in recent times has been between 35, let's say, and 150 years in duration. That's the duration of the cooling period, the crop loss period, the global unrest periods. And the time in between is more regular. The time in between the minimums is 100 years. And
Yes,
so
there's a 50-year cycle, a 90-year cycle, a 206-year cycle are the three main cycles that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the Dalton Minimum was the lesser of the Grand Minima, the 100 years ago one, but 200 years ago was the Dalton, and we're headed back into a Dalton-like minimum now. What the chart, the reason I put the chart up, Lee, was to explain that you cannot determine when the beginning and end of this Grand Solar Minimum, the Eddy Minimum, will be until it's all over. It will be looked at, and they'll see the curve down on the initial point, and then the curve back up on the other point, and then that's how they'll determine the length of the Eddy Minimum. So on a prior show, you said that you think that the Grand Solar Minimum begins at cycle 24, which would be around 2009. Is that correct?
No, sir. I used the exact date that Jack Eddy would have used because he's the one that determined it. And so that's the date that was established by Jack Eddy's method by John Casey, and that would be February of 2004, which shows the signature of the beginning of a Grand Solar Minimum by the second peak being higher than the first peak of solar sunspot counts during a progressional decrease in solar cycle activity at a rate of approximately 70% decrease each cycle. So if you look back starting at 21 and then 22 and 23 and 24, and you look at their peaks of each one of those solar cycles as they fall off, you'll see that there's approximately a 30% decrease each cycle as it comes down until we reach solar cycle 24. At solar cycle 24, we had two peaks, and the second peak being larger than the first peak shows that indeed that is the beginning and will be marked as the beginning of the Grand Solar Minimum that we are entering, which is known as the Eddy Minimum, named after Jack Eddy. Yes, sir.
So is it 2014 then? Is it at the peak of the second higher peak?
Yes, at April, or excuse me, at the beginning of February 2014.
2014. Okay.
Yes, sir. And so that will be, when you look at it scientifically, when this is analyzed, in future generations, and you look at the definition, because as far as I'm concerned, the modern definition of what a Grand Solar Minimum is was written by Dr. Jack Eddy. Okay, and his work was picked up by John Casey and continued on. I have spent many, many thousands of hours researching all of the work that both of those gentlemen did, and then I went back and looked at all the stuff that Leif Svensgaard did, going back with all of the solar cycles and sunspots, going all the way back to the 1600s and 1400s of looking at sunspot activity, and then went beyond that with solar activity, actually going back to 400 BC, because that is the actual first recordings of sunspot activity by the Chinese. So you've got to look at all of those cycles and see the individual signature of what the sun does to designate the beginning of a Grand Solar Minimum. And Eddy and Casey, going back through carbon-14, pine cone data, different coral, stalactite, stalagmite, 14 different data sets, including the Atlantic Sea, the sea ice, as well as Atlantic, Pacific, and other ocean deep core sediments, as well as deep lake sediments from all over the world. So all of that put together, and then to confirm that all of that lines up with cosmic rays, galactic cosmic rays, decrease in solar activity, decrease in Earth's temperatures, Dr. Kirkby from CERN, when he was putting together the Cloud Project, went back and did all of this research independently and brought that forward so as that he could actually get the funding for the Cloud Project, and correlated, in his words, exquisitely all of these different data sets that show that as we get into a Grand Solar Minimum, galactic cosmic rays and cosmic rays increase. We can see the difference between a storm and regular activity because of how those carbon-14 and beryllium-10 elements are distributed over the planet. So that's how we know when it began.
Well, and I'm going to agree with you 100%. And it's because of the double peak and the second peak being higher that and that's absolutely what many of us in the community were waiting for as the signal prior to it actually happening.
Correct. And I was, when I interviewed John Casey about it, he knew, and he knew the exact minute. I can't remember it now, but it was like 3:40 in the afternoon was when he said, "Okay, yes, here it has began." And then the next thing he did was called the White House. So.
Okay, so from my research, Lee, and that would correlate well from with what I'm about to tell you, based on the chart that I. Go ahead.
I do want to interject one thing that you had mentioned that I do not. It's worse than what you had said. So you had said that we were going back into a Dalton minimum type of state. So when you look and you compare the curves of the Dalton minimum, the Spurrier minimum, the Maunder minimum, and so on and so forth, as far as the rate of sunspot decline as the TSI falls off and that curve and how that falls off, we actually passed the curve of the Dalton minimum about 8 months ago. And now we are definitely into the curve of the Maunder minimum. And if we don't start pulling out here pretty quick with a little bit more sunspot activity, we'll actually be going lower in sunspot activity than what we did during the Maunder minimum. And to do that calculation, you have to actually do the math backwards that NASA does now. So whatever NASA's sunspot count is, divide that by 15. And if you divide that by 15, you will have the actual sunspot counts of during the Maunder minimum, the Dalton minimum, the Spurrier, so on and so forth. Because what we see on the sun now was not visible to them at that time with the optics that they had to be able to observe the sun. So, it's like I said the other day on my Twitter account, they were trying to turn a speck into a sunspot as opposed to a molehill into a mountain. So, when you look at all of how it's looked at and you want to get a full picture of it, you've got to, even out or average out the math going back in history, because for the last, 2 years now, the sunspot number that NASA has been spitting out is not really the number of what's actually on there, because a single sunspot now can actually count as 11 sunspots, as opposed to it might have even counted as a sunspot back during the Maunder minimum period.
Yeah, I agree that by cycle 25, we'll be down in Maunder in new territory, really. We're going to be dropping lower and lower. And with the cosmic rays increasing, we'll be also in new uncharted territories as far as cosmic rays. And this coupled with the waning magnetosphere. Now, what I was going to say is with my historical research, what it shows based on when they start the minimum and when they end the minimum is that the cooling usually takes about 10 years before the cooling happens. So 2024 should be a very cold period based on historical minimums. What say you?
Well, when you look at it by the averages, you could say yes. We're talking 5 to 7 years of the cooling period, or possibly as long as 10 years. But what controls that is where the AMO and the PDO are within their cycles. So if you go into a minimum condition with the decreased output power of the sun, and the AMO and the PDO are still coming up within their cycles, then yes, that will continue to push that on and give you that 5, 7, 10 years of cooling. However, when you have a plunging AMO and a plunging PDO like we are going into now, you can find that we can drop in temperature in as short as 3 years. So I'm saying 3 to 5 years as opposed to 10. And I think that we will really start seeing some of the cold effects of this, like I've been saying for years, this winter in the northern regions of the United States and Europe.
Okay, now you sent me some links from a suspicious observer, Ben Davidson. He's recently put out a 3-part series on climate change, specifically climate change denial, so to speak, because all of the things in all 3 of his videos are the fact that global warming, albeit their models are correct, is all based on a false premise. They do not include the sun, and all of the forcing mechanisms that they do not include, they put onto man, which makes the models even more insanely wrong. And so for decades, all the models have been off and all the models have been wrong. And still, all the headlines in the newspapers are still saying global warming, global warming, global warming, global warming.
Absolutely. And, I've been pointing this out that, CO2 is a trace gas. And it's very hard for something that is a trace gas to, how should we say, dramatically affect the thermodynamic properties of the other gases around it. CO2 does not have that capability, because of its trace gas amounts. Additionally, when you look back through history, and as I do, going back, 480,000 years, you will find that CO2 always follows temperature on an average of about 800 years. So you can't say that, you get more CO2, the temperature is going to go up, because it doesn't work that way. The temperature goes up, then the CO2 goes up. Then the temperature goes down, and the CO2 goes down. And the oceans actually hold 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere does. So, of course, the oceans are just like a soft drink. When you warm them up, it releases the CO2. So, of course, you warm up the oceans, CO2 comes out, you cool down the oceans, the CO2 goes back in. And so that is the process. We are in a 206-year cycle known as RC theory, where the Earth cools for 30 years and then heats for 176 years. So we have just completed the 176 years of heating. That ended in February of 2014, and now we're going to move into the 30 years of drastic cooling. And so the first few years, I say it's like coming off the top of a roller coaster. The first few years of that, you are barely moving down in temperature, but once the last car of that roller coaster crests the top of the hill and you get everything behind you, then you drop very rapidly. So what will we have behind us? We will have the cosmic rays coming in, creating the additional nucleation, which creates more cloud cover, so you have less energy coming in on the planet. You have decreased TSI from the sun, and then, of course, you have less energy on the planet coming in as a total because of the albedo effect, and the PDO coming down and the AMO coming down. And when all of those are coming down together, and then you get more snowfall, and that creates more refraction of energy back into space, it basically avalanches, and the temperature drops faster and faster and faster. And that's how you drop off rapidly to do the 3 years as opposed to the 10 years. And we're the 3 year this time.
Yes, I would agree with you. Now, why do you think Ben Davidson in his comments doesn't agree with us? He thinks that we're not. Now, I looked at all those comments, and to me, it seems like what he's saying is that we're not in grand minimum, meaning we're not at the bottom, and we're not. We won't be at the bottom for a while, and we should be dropping off all the way for at least several decades into a TSI bottom. And maybe he's talking about that as the grand minima, the bottom.
I didn't take it that way. I take it as that he hasn't done the same research I have. He doesn't understand when a grand solar minimum actually begins as far as the nomenclature of what it is and those triggering events. I don't think he's followed John Casey's work, and he's done the same research, because when someone establishes a definition of what something is, that's just the definition. So, this is when John Casey, and based on Jack Eddy's work. So if somebody wants to say that they're more of an authority on the Maunder minimum and sunspot activity than Jack Eddy, then they need to come forward and say who they are and what allows them to make the claim that they know more about minimums and sunspot activity than Jack Eddy and John Casey. Now I've watched, some people will say, well, Leaf Garrison or whatever his last name, or I always get his last name wrong, but Svolgard or whatever it is. They say that he's an expert on sunspot activity and predicting solar cycles and so on and so forth. But I disagreed with his recent prediction, and he in my opinion, still wasn't accurate. We're still not done with solar cycle 24. And he believed months ago that we had already started cycle 25. And if you look at Valentina Zarkova's work with the decreasing magnetic fields in the sun, because those fields are going out of phase here very soon over the next cycle, and then we've got a cycle in between, and then the other two pair are going to go out of phase. You know, you're talking 30 years just to go through that. And when you look back historically at grand minimum, you have a 206-year cycle and a 412-year cycle. The 412-year cycle is normally worse because at that point in time, you have two sets of fields going out of phase as opposed to only a single set. And in this particular application, or this particular case of it, those fields going out of phase, those fields are going out of phase at the worst possible time and over the worst possible duration. And that's going back, you know, in history, 450,000 years, because they're not one on top of each other, and they're not significantly apart from each other. They're one cycle apart from each other. So you've got one set of magnetic fields trying to cancel each other out, creating regions of magnetic instability. So you've got going into that cancellation phase, coming out of that cancellation phase, then a cycle, then going into a cancellation phase, and then coming out of a cancellation phase again. So the possibilities during that period of time for CME activity is extremely high. And when you look back historically, we've got reports of massive CMEs of the Carrington event. We've got them in the 1600s, the 1400s, the 1200s. So it continues to go back that you have these CME type activities every time you have these fields going out of phase during the low part of the grand solar minimum, as you're dropping deeply into it before it comes back to its 176 years of warming. So during the first phase of the massive drop off, which is where we are now, and then as we start to come back out, which was where we will be probably in 40 years, in between that is where we have a lot of the CME activity, with the majority being at the very beginning and the other majority being at the very end, with about maybe 20% being in the middle. So you're looking at 40% at the beginning, 40% at the end, and 20% in the middle. And anything above an X27 is considered detrimental to the critical infrastructure of the planet. And the last massive CME that we had coming out of the backside of the sun equaled an X47, which is way, way, way more powerful than what we as Earthlings would be able to stand as far as our grid or infrastructure that we see on a day-to-day life now.
Okay, I'm going to read a quote from Ben Davidson, Suspicious Observers. The minimum is not here. The odd-even rule dictates that this next one will not be a dud, and the grand minimum might not get here until mid-century.
Again,
now, I want to respond to that. First of all, just based on the periodicity of all of the last 5 grand minimas, with 100 years in between, and the centennial minimum ending in 1914, that puts the beginning of this one at 2014. That's based on 5 past. So why this one would start 50 years late, I have no idea. And that's just where I'm coming from. And go ahead, Lee.
Well, you can't look at it as an odd even what it's going to do here, there, and yonder. You have to look at what all of the previous cycles were. So when you look at 21, 22, 23, 24, and you look at the fall off of that, that's the indicator you're moving towards that with the downward trend of sunspot activity. Then the trigger that shows that it started and you will be moving into this is the double peak. And so it doesn't matter if it's odd or even or tall or short or whatever. If it reaches the 3 cycles previously, 30% decrease in each one of those cycles output power, and then a double peak with the second peak higher, that's the beginning of a grand solar minimum. That's the definition by Eddie and by John Casey, and that's the definition that I go by and anybody else that I've spoken with goes by, with the exception of Mr. Davidson. So if he has someone else who has another definition other than that one, I would like to see that, but I haven't seen it. And additionally, the only issue I have is that it's a grand solar minimum. I've never heard of anyone calling it a what's he call it? A solar? It's not he calls it a solar grand minimum as opposed to a grand solar minimum. Again, I'm not aware of anything ever being called a solar grand minimum either. Everyone that I've spoken with and all the research I've seen shows it's a grand solar minimum. So again, I just say that he has not done the same research and maybe not at the same level. I mean, I've got 9,000 hours in ground solar minimum as of several months ago. So he studies all kinds of things. I study mainly the grand solar minimum, electric universe theory, and the Sapphire Project. Those are the three main things that I study as far as, studying a grand solar minimum.
Yeah, and that double peak is the basis of it all. And I don't know where that definition that he is suggesting that the grand minimum is not coming till mid-century. I don't know where he's getting that information from either, because the mainstream suggests that the sun is going to recover in mid-century.
Yes, some of them are. And that's in the U.S. If you look at the Russian, it's not. The Russians are saying it's even worse than what we're saying. The Russians are, already saying that we're going to do the modern minimum. So that's been their prediction here for a number of years as well. And, that's one thing that John Casey and I did disagree on, because when you look at his work and you look at the work of Valentina Zarkova and then Heinrich Svenmark's work as far as cloud nucleation, and then the research that Dr. Kirkby did at CERN, and you put all those together and you actually start doing the math, and then you look at the aerosol counts that are in the atmosphere that man has put in there from exhaust and ship exhaust, number 2 bunker in ships, all the jet planes and so on and so forth. If you have the exact same TSI and the exact same amount of galactic cosmic rays that we had during the modern minimum, this time it would be colder because we have additional particles in the atmosphere for that cloud nucleation, so we would have a wee bit more refraction from that. So, we're already set up to do below a modern minimum if it continues at the rate that we're falling off, plus the fact that we're at, in modern times, all-time high levels of cosmic rays coming into our atmosphere, streaming out of the coronal hole streams in our sun. So that's going to increase this nucleation. That's also going to create more nitric oxide gas generated in the upper atmosphere and act like what NASA calls, and quoting them, a giant air conditioner in the atmosphere that you can't turn off. So, all of these things are coming. We're going to see them. It's going to affect our crops. It's going to affect our growing seasons. It's going to affect our yields because of decreased solar energy striking the plants and decreasing the amount of photosynthesis within those plants. So all of this has been inching its way in and rearing its ugly head here and there. And this year in the winter, it's going to start being a little worse.
And now I got my start, Lee, in paleoclimatology in the early 1990s. Almost 3 decades ago. And it's now my contention and my belief, and one of the main reasons why I have a YouTube show is because I also believe that not only is this just a grand solar minimum, but with the waning magnetosphere, because of the magnetic excursion that's happening now, I am also under the impression that this is the end of the interstadial, i.e. the end of the Holocene. And that will be sometime around 2035 when the magnetosphere reaches its minimum and the poles meet somewhere west of Indonesia. Because of what you just described about that air conditioner effect. I've been looking for that mechanism for the rapid glaciation that occurs every 11,500 years through these Milankovitch cycles, and I believe it is the magnetic reversals. And it's the cosmic rays that lead to the cooling and the volcanoes in epic proportions on this particular grand solar minimum. There have been others in the past. We've been in the Holocene for, thousands of years, but I think it's coming to an end. How do you feel about that interpretation?
Well, we're overdue. I mean, we should have already went back into full glaciation, because when you look at it, going back, we're normally only in these warm epochs for about 10,000 years or so. So by everybody's calculation, we're at least 1,500 years overdue from dropping back into it. But when you look at the long-term trend, you're absolutely right, because for the last 3,000 years, we've been cooling. The medieval warm periods were much warmer than they are now. The 30s, even in 1936, was much, much warmer than it is now. So, we're continuing to drop off. This winter, we're going to see some of the weather like we did, back in 77, 78, as far as, some blizzards up across, the upper parts of the United States. And that's going to continue, like you're saying, as we go into this minimum. Now, we have a possibility in 2050, 2078, wherever, somewhere out through there, that we can, after we go through these two magnetic reversals and the 4 different magnetic fields of the sun, to come back up and peak a little bit. And I would expect that. But that cycle after that is going to, again, start falling back down. The TSI is going to start falling a little bit more, and we're going to continue to eventually fall off into glaciation. Now, will the sun last until 2050? Because if you look at the work of Wolf Witche, and how you look at how a plasma field can decrease and the solar wind speeds can decrease and the sun can go into a lower glow mode, when you look at the rate of decrease of that, according to Wolf's work, will we last all the way out to 2100? Absolutely not. Will we last to 2050? Probably not. Because I don't think that we have to come to all the way to 0 solar wind speed from coronal holes to get to a point of where the sun goes to a lower state of glow mode within its plasma discharge. So that could come much sooner than 2050 if the sun actually does that every 100,000 years.
Yeah, that would be an insane turn of events if that was just happening in a decade or so.
Well, that'll be an insane turn of events no matter when it happens.
Yeah, because the output of the sun will essentially shut off, and it would be very cold that day.
Yeah, it will start that day. And I think that we will see, and I've seen some things in the sun that make me think that we're already moving towards that. So if you ever look at a fluorescent light bulb that is starting to flicker in the ends, it will change how it reacts in the ends, and that's because there's a change in pressure within that fluorescent tube, which is actually a plasma. And so as we are streaming these particles out of the sun, we're decreasing the sun's pressure. That's why the solar wind speed is decreasing. So as we continue to do that, we'll actually start seeing fluctuations within the output of the sun. And some of the things I've been seeing lately on TSI and spectral leads me to believe that we're actually starting to move into that flickering stage. So, I start following Wolf's work a little more closely, because it looks more like that, Wolf is accurate in what he's saying. And when you look at plasma and how a plasma sphere ionizes and gets energized and comes into a glow mode and goes through its different levels of glow mode and the double layers and so on and so forth, as you change the voltages and currents within it, you will see that there's changes within the matter as how it moves around, and the layers that you see within it and the energy, and there's some flickering that can go on within that prior to going into that lower mode or coming out of that. And when you talk about Velikovsky's work of worlds in collision, if there ever were a time of which the sun would be in rare form and choose to annihilate a planet with a extreme solar discharge, be it a plasma discharge or a CME, this is the time that it would do that, because this is the time that it's weak. This is the time that the internal pressure is falling down, and this is the time that we have 4 magnetic fields, 2 of which are going out of phase first, and then the other 2 fields that are going out of phase, which again, each time you do that, you have regions of magnetic instability that ejects these CMEs. So that's the concern that I have going into this and going through this, no matter where you are on the planet.
Well, and then Jesus is coming.
Well, of course.
Yeah, during all this, which is crazy. Like, why would he choose now? Why would he come during the solar max and, hung out at the beach? So let's talk about the temperature. Let's talk about Roy Spencer's temperature data. For those that are listening, go check out Roy Spencer. Just put it in Google, and you can see the latest global atmospheric temperature data from UAH satellite. And it shows that we're 0.38 degrees above baseline back into the 80s. In fact, it shows no global warming for decades. It shows natural climate variability for 2 decades. And it shows in the last 2 years that we've dropped 0.5 degree C. Talk about it.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to continue to do that. And what people don't realize about a grand solar minimum is it's not a case.
Oh, hold us on, Lee. We have a commercial, and we get time to take a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about the global temperatures coming out of the University of Alabama, Huntsville, Dr. Roy Spencer's work, and we're going to be unraveling the inconvenient truth, prepping for the grand solar minimum. Stay with us. Thanks, Lee.
Anytime.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
This is Barbara DeLong, host of Nightlight Radio, inviting you to join me on a cosmic journey, exploring a metaphysical montage of spiritual material, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between, including spiritual readings for those who seek enlightenment. Let Nightlight provide you with equal measure of light, love and laughter, insight, wisdom, and inspiration. Monday nights, 10 to 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Studio B, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. It's Diamond Dime with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and we're back with the second half of the Inconvenient Truth. Our guest tonight, Lee Wheelbarger, subject matter expert, military electronic systems, not to mention the 9,000 grand solar minimum hours he's got under his belt. He follows the work of John Casey, the relational cycle. He's very familiar with those pioneers that came before us, giving the names to these minimums, the Maunders, the Eddies. And now we're talking about some actual untampered, unhomogenized temperature data. Now, the problem with the temperature data coming from NASA, NOAA, data sets that the IPCC uses, even the BOM, they've been exposed over the last several years manipulating data. We have uncovered multiple data manipulations by NASA as they cool the past and warm the future. This gives them more of the hockey stick that they're looking for, the global warming narrative that the sheep will gobble up on the newspapers. Oh, we're burning up, we're burning up. But if you just go over to a realist like Dr. Roy Spencer, PhD, over to his website, the University of Alabama Huntsburg global lower tropospheric atmosphere numbers show no global warming for decades. They, in fact, show a marked decrease in temperature since 2016, that El Nino, and Lee was just about to comment on that. Lee, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you that the data has been tampered with, but even in addition to the data being tampered with, we've had the removal of rural weather stations and then the moving of metropolitan weather stations to heat islands. So, for example, some of the weather stations were moved from parks to the end of airport runways, sitting over the tarmac next to the FAA building, on the south side of the building, with the air conditioner discharge blowing on it. And when that's not warming it up, you've got jets sitting there on the taxiway blowing their exhaust towards the building. And so when you look at this and you go and because I spent many hours researching this to actually find the truth about what the actual surface temperatures are. And what we found is, in some places, the heat island effect, because of the location of these and the fact that they're in a metropolitan area, was increasing the temperature of that particular metropolitan area by as much as 10%. So if it's 100 degrees outside, it's going to show that that city is actually 110 because of where they put the thermometers. And then in doing more research on that, I've actually found that in the same city, you can get 5 different temperatures varying as much as 8 degrees within the same city, depending upon which source you use. So I don't go by that. So I use the same site that you use, and have used that for a good while now, and believe that that is the most accurate site to use for the truth on the internet as far as what the temperature is down here on the ground, because we don't really care about what it is way up in the atmosphere. I mean, the top-down model has only been in existence since 1993, and there's been many revisions and other things that still need to be added to that model. So, you can't always go by that. And the Roy Spencer's site has shown significantly that we are cooling and moving in that cooling trend, and have been for a while. And, it goes up and down, it varies, but that is part of the Pacific Decadal, the Atlantic, so the AMO, the PDO, and other things that go on, and sunspot activity will fluctuate that. But again, the trend is moving down, and it's going to continue to do that as we continue to progress into the grand solar minimum.
But Lee, why would they move the monitoring stations to areas where they get bad science? I mean, it is all our fault, isn't it? All this warming that hasn't happened in 20 years, it's all our fault, and we owe the government money, don't we?
Well, they got paid to show that it's warming. And, everybody has their own little way of manipulating the data in their own way. They change things around, they move things, they remove sites, they change the curve. And, my favorite line is, man-made global warming only exists in the mind of Dr. Mann. Because when you look at the science of it, it doesn't make sense, and Dr. Spencer and many others have went before Congress, and I've watched all of their testimonies many times, that of the evidence that they brought before Congress, and I've spoken with people from CERN and other particle physics labs and so on and so forth around the world to get everybody's take on this, and nobody can come forward with the data that proves that CO2 warms the way Dr. Mann claims it does. In fact, Dr. Mann was unable to provide the data that proved his claims, and to date, as far as I know, has never provided the data to back up his claims. And so as we move forward and we actually look at what's going on in the world, and there's a quote, and I can't remember the gentleman's name that said it, but if what is observed doesn't match the model, then the model is wrong. And no model is accurate. They just help. So you've got to look at what is observed and then compare what you see with what we have seen historically in order to be able to try to make some type of a projection of what we may see in the future. And all of my models are based on historic data as far as these curves with sunspots and decreasing in sunspot numbers and the formation of the sunspot cycle. And so that's what everything I do is based on, and the size of the sunspots and the magnetic fields and how that interacts with our atmosphere with charged particles and creating nitric oxide gas and ozone with the UV and so on and so forth, and how those spectrums of light will actually penetrate through the cloud cover and hit the planet. And what a lot of people leave out of the model is the fact that currently we're at about 1,360 watts per square meter of energy hitting the planet. If we were to magically snap our fingers and remove all of the clouds from the planet, that would immediately jump from 1,360 to 1,390. Now, you only have to have a change of like from 1,360 to 59 or 58 to have a dramatic change on the planet. So that's just a few watts. And if you look at what the IPCC and other groups say the total amount of anthropogenic warming is equal to about 1.5 watts. But yet when you look at the cloud cover on the planet and the increase in the cloud cover, so you say, okay, the clouds create a blockage of 30 watts per square meter. So if you were to increase the cloud cover by just 10%, that would be 3 watts per square meter. Well, with the increase in cosmic rays that we've got coming in and the projections that are coming forward, we're talking about an increase or total increase in cloud cover of an excess of 13%. Well, 13% would be at least 3 watts of refracted energy, which is more than twice the amount of total anthropogenic warming created by man. And if you really want to cut down on the amount of CO2 that's being emitted into the atmosphere, you've got to get the termites under control because they emit 7 times as much CO2 as man does. So, there's the priorities are all wrong, just like in California, running water into the ocean to feed a fish or support a fish that's not even in danger, but yet they're not supporting the farmers that are trying to grow crops for the population. People need to get their priorities right, and they need to understand what it is that is actually making these changes in our weather and the temperature and all of these crop failures and hailstorms and unbelievable lightning, and realize it's not CO2, it's our sun, which drives everything on this planet.
Yeah, it's not you. In fact, what's wacking up the weather right now is cosmic rays. And cosmic rays are forecast to increase into epic territory over the next 100 years. Now, what that means is anyone's guess. But just like Lee said, over the next decade or so, cosmic rays may increase by 20%, which is going to increase cloud cover by that same amount, which is going to rapidly cool the Earth. If you increase cloud cover by that amount, it will have an epic effect on watts per square meter on the surface. Definitely dropping us below 1359.
Yeah, and when you look at it, there's only a few degrees difference between a Maunder minimum climate and the climate we're in now. And so it doesn't take much to make a catastrophic change in the climate on the planet. And, when you talk about full glaciation, you're still only talking about a total of no more than 20 degrees. So, it's not that much of a major change. It's the fact that we decrease the amount of TSI, so that shuts down the photosynthesis in the plants. The soil temperatures will remain below 56 degrees longer, so you have a shorter growing season, and then you have less precipitation. When it comes, it's in a deluge or in the form of hail or snow, and destroys your crops late in the spring and freezes them early in the fall. So you lose your crops on both ends. And it's that, along with the cold, that's what's going to be so detrimental to the public. The fact that the crops are going to fail, and we're going to have, massive cases of famine, just like we have always had historically during these types of events.
Indeed, and I want to go back and touch on CO2 a little bit more and the fraud Michael Mann and his hockey shtick. The guy is such a fraud that when he goes to a conference, he has to bring his graph with him because there are no global temperature data sets that match his graph. And let's get back to Dr. Roy Spencer's UAH atmospheric data that shows no global warming for 20 years. In fact, natural climate variability rising and falling about 0.4 degrees C on average on a decadal scale. And now during that same 20-year period, CO2 on Earth has gone up faster than ever before. Now, if you rule your life based on common sense, wouldn't you pick up on the fact that the temperature should be skyrocketing at a time when CO2 is, past 400? They said when we passed 350 we were going to burn up, and now CO2 has gone up 50% in just a few decades, and temperature is stable. The CO2 model is a complete farce. It's really not based on science. Like our friend Ben Davidson says, it's based on a false premise. And the entire scientific endeavor of modern climatology, and I reiterate modern climatology, because I'm a paleoclimatologist, we use science, facts, and data. Now, modern climatology is based on a false premise that CO2 warms the Earth. And if you start your entire science on a false premise, think about how many dollars have been wasted at universities. Think about how many hundreds of scientists believe complete nonsense. And think about the tax dollars going into the funding, paying the networks and the cacophony of nonsense to set your tax code. It's absolutely insane, the world we're living in. And I truly believe that the narrative is getting so insane simply because of the times we're entering. The information stream is going to get more wacky. The divisions are going to get more varied. And just like in all historical times, this is when the wars begin. And we can already see there's migrations occurring. And the crop losses began now. They're going to be very bad. I believe that the winter 2018-19, and based on all my calculations from years ago, this was the winter. And if the relational cycle is correct, this is the winter when the New Madrid faults as well. We are waiting on a magnitude 8 or greater to happen in the coming weeks. And these are all scientific facts that we know. We're not making any of this up. Global warming, 100% made up. Based on what I just told you, it is based on a false premise that CO2 warms the planet. If CO2 has just increased 50% in the last few decades, how come the temperature hasn't followed suit? It's in fact moderated. It's in fact following suit with the solar output. Are you picking up what we're putting down? I know Lee is. What do you think about all the things I just said, Lee?
Well, you're pretty much right on target. I mean, we know that CO2 levels in the past have been twice what they are right now. And so, I said in one of the conferences that I attended that no, and I think I actually said it on your show as well, no vital gas such as CO2 or oxygen should ever be deemed a toxin. Because without CO2, we're not here. So, too much of anything can be bad, just like oxygen or anything else. But we're not to that level. When you look at the amount of CO2 that is allowed inside of a submarine through their scrubbers and what they still consider good, clean air, it's way, way, way higher than what we live in every day. And there are greenhouses all over the world that are actually injecting CO2 inside of their greenhouses to improve their yield from their plants. Other people are using mushrooms to create that CO2. So CO2 is a good thing. And for people to come up with the assumption that it controls the temperature of the planet without hard science to back that up is just people who haven't actually done the research and investigated themselves. They just go along with the consensus and give it a check mark and a rubber stamp. And, for what I've done for my career for the government, I can't do that. I've never been allowed to do that. I have to prove what I say and have the science behind it so as that I can make my recommendation. Because, like the generals tell me, Lee, if you get it wrong, people die. And so I can't get it wrong. So that's why I always strive to do the best I can and know as much as I can about a subject before I speak on that subject. So, if I'm wrong on something, please advise me that I'm wrong so that I can correct my stance. But that doesn't come very often because I do the thorough research that the government has demanded from me for 3 decades.
Indeed. Or you'd be fired. It's called due diligence. It's how people do good work. And it's gotten scientists far. And the short-sightedness of this CO2 nonsense. You said that CO2 has been much higher. Lee, the average CO2, geologically speaking, is 2,300 parts per million to 2,900. That's the average range, between 2,300 parts per million to 2,900. For over 80% of all geologic history of life on Earth, that's the range. Now, you were talking about CO2 enrichment. Do you know how much CO2 is purchased by the marijuana industry? It increases their yields up to 80%. And it's not expensive to make CO2. The insanity of the governments and the lies perpetrated on the masses. Now, sheeple, if any of you happen to get into the radio show and are listening, let me assure you that science has nothing to do with consensus. That word is not a word that is in scientific circles. In fact, the greatest scientists are outliers. They think outside the box. There are no groups of people following other people, nodding their heads. That's insane. That's a cult. The alien ship is behind the asteroid, and we need to go up and save them. Drink the Kool-Aid. There is no consensus in science. There is a consensus in paid-off shills that are scared to death to lose their jobs. That's where the consensus is. And the consensus is the planet's warming, and they better prove it. So they're actually moving scientific monitoring devices in hotter areas so they can get more funding. That's sick. And you're sending your children to the public... Oh, go ahead, Lee.
When they did that, they actually saw a spike in the data, and they had to go back and average that out to cover that spike up. So if you go back and research when all of that was done and the effects of it and so on and so forth, you can see where they covered their tracks doing that by what they did. just like the way NASA is counting sunspots now, saying there's 15 instead of saying there's 1, or saying there's 11 instead of there's 1. And, it's kind of like, why would you do that? We've been counting sunspots the same way for hundreds of years. Why would now all of a sudden that we're going into a grand solar minimum, you're all of a sudden changing the way we count sunspots, and rather than making it even close to what it used to be, it's 15 times higher. And these are the things that just puzzle me, why it's been so good a certain way for so long, and now all of a sudden that it's falling off, you're artificially inflating the numbers. Because, if you look, like I said, if you look at the numbers now, we're already down there compared to what we were during Maunder, Spoyer, and Dalton. We're really down there, especially when you look at the end of this cycle and you realize that solar cycles that are weaker cycles can be much longer than 11 years. They can stretch out almost to 14 years. So, you can't say that because of this cycle was going to be 11 years because of the low amplitude and the number of sunspots. More than likely, it's going to be out past 11 years, 12 years, somewhere along in there.
Yeah, this double peak with the second peak high, that's a 12-year cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that brings us in this minimum through 2021. I don't think that the public is ready for what's going to happen over the next few years.
I don't think anybody is. And the thing that, I like pointing out basically almost on a daily basis is, all these scientists are coming out. The sun is weakening at an unbelievable rate. We may be going into a grand solar minimum. How cold will it be? They got all these headlines about all these doctors and astrophysicists, and everybody's freaking out about what the sun is doing. Well, myself, John Casey, Valentina Zarkova, we're not freaking out. Neither are the astrophysicists in Russia or in Japan or in Italy or any of the other countries that know what a grand solar minimum is and have been following this since 2009. Of what this could possibly be, and we know exactly what it's going to do. So we're not surprised at all. We're going, oh yeah, that's exactly on time. Or no, we've progressed a little bit more, and that's been in my predictions based on the curve of what it's done is we're accelerating a little more. I was hoping for a Dalton minimum. My God, 2 years ago, I was hoping it was only going to be a Dalton minimum. It looked like it was going to be a Dalton minimum, but no, it has progressed much faster and moved in towards more of a Maunder minimum when you look at the curve of the drop off and so on and so forth, and you go matching up all of the different sunspot cycles. And so, that's what I go by. That's what I've went by. And that's why all of us who are in the know are not surprised at all. We're exactly on pace for where we should be going down this road.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Lee. And this is another talking point to some of Ben Davidson's comments a day ago. He said that we all got our start with him, and I disagree with that. I got my start when he was a child in the university studying paleoclimatology. You got your start in the military being a subject matter expert, and we have used the Grand Solar Minimum community, all of us, to our advantage so that we can grow in the knowledge base that we have so we can make better predictions. And the reason we all have differing opinions, so to speak, is because that's what science is about. If the Grand Solar Minimum community was in consensus about everything, then there would be something wrong, which is why you should be questioning the consensus in the global warming community. Now, I think, Lee, you and I are more on the same page, and I take it a little further with the end of the interstadial, where I think that we're going to rapidly, in the next 300 years, be 5 degrees colder, headed towards 9 degrees colder, and a very long glacial period for 11,000 more years until the next magnetic reversal pops us out of it. And maybe it's a cosmogenic effect at that point, but from my experience in my geologic studies, what I found basin-wide in all sedimentary basins throughout the world, from the Cambrian to the present, is a 26,000-year precessional cycle with a deep phase and a shallow phase. There's an immediate deepening of the oceans, which we just saw 11,500 years ago, and is a stable period for half of the cycle. And then there's a sea level fall surface around 11,500 years in, halfway through the cycle, and then the seas are shallow for the rest of the cycle until the next sea level rise. This is the precessional signal, and I've seen it for all of geologic history. And I believe that we're on the sea level fall surface. Now, in our recent glacial time frame, this is the time period when Heinrich events occur, which is when massive icebergs are spotted all the way in the tropics. And this is what happens when ice starts to build, because we still have seasons. So in the summer, if we're building massive quantities of ice, we have massive glaciers breaking off and moving south along the coasts. In fact, ancient man even harvested water off of these because, like Lee suggests, we are going to lose 80% of our precipitation. So if a glacier washes up on shore, you better drink it. Now, these ideas may seem extreme, but they're all based on science. And we may be right on point. What do you think, Lee?
Yeah, you have cycles, and the entire universe is cycles. And so, when you can see these cycles and be able to determine what's coming based upon those cycles and the observables, you can say whatever you want or what you think is happening, but you have to look at the observables, and that's what tells you what's really happening. And different people see the exact same thing and say different things. And I've got two sayings that I've heard. One is, people are looking into the wrong end of the telescope trying to explain to you what they think they see. And there's a Dr. Scott from the electric universe theory was talking about, you're up in space and you look down onto a planet and you see a highway and there's a car on that highway and it's sitting on the side of the highway, and all of a sudden it takes off and accelerates up the highway. And the scientist says, see, that's the effects of the high torque from an internal combustion engine. And the other scientist said, well, yeah, but we've seen the effects of it, and actually that's a Tesla. So, if you don't look at everything that's there and be open-minded about what could possibly be there, you're not going to see it. And that's one of the things that I've seen in trying to talk with astrophysicists and other folks about this, and particle physicists, people from CERN. They are so dead set on what they were taught in college that they won't take the blinders off to even look at research that was conducted within their own institution. And that's what we are facing, because people have been educated that no, it's global warming, and it's not. It's we are going into this. We are going to continue to progress into this, and there is no doubt that we will eventually drop off into full-blown glaciation, because we're already overdue. And if you look at the signs, we are going that way. There's no doubt about that, no matter how you look at the science. All of the indicators, and we've known this since the 70s, that we are moving back into glaciation, and that can be coming with this, without a doubt. So I agree with you on that.
Great, and let's get with the brainwashing. Now, I've been studying the brain for years, brain patterning, brainwashing, suggestive learning, and all the way through therapy, and and even going through Jung and Velikovsky, how humanity is suffering a grave amnesia from past catastrophes. Now, I believe that the powers that be and the elites know this, which is why the global warming narrative is out there, so that you can believe in nonsense. And I also believe that that's what keeps us in this slavery model of the daily grind, where we finally get to retire and we die. It really doesn't need to be like that, but because of brain patterning, like you said, people are blinded. and they're blinded up through from grade school through the public school system. They're indoctrinated into the universities, which are now controlled by the crony capitalistic system, where you better learn my global warming model or you won't get funding. Now, I was in the university right when that was taking a chokehold. Literally, people making up stuff to prove warming was insane. It was fun. You just had to make stuff up in order to get funded. And that's just part of the ruse that's being perpetrated on you. And it goes back really deep. Like the natives that were in North America, they couldn't see the ships on the shore because they had never seen them before. Lee, have you ever heard of this story? And then it wasn't until they actually touched the ships and were able to meet the people that they could see the ships?
No, I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's like their brain was incapable of understanding what a ship was because they had never seen one. Just like people are incapable of seeing another model because they're so indoctrinated from the one they've grown up with. Do you know how difficult it is to change someone's mind about global warming that has no scientific background? It would be like telling them that they're not breathing air, they're breathing Gatorade. It just wouldn't make any sense. And I think that's how deep the ruse is.
It's 8 times harder to correct a memory once it's been established than it is to learn it initially.
So do you think the powers that be use this against us on purpose because they know that?
Well, when you look at the way that the media operates and the fact that there are 6 major media outlets and they work together, and that's mainly when you talk about the mainstream media politically driven by these 6 major news media outlets that control 90% of what we see. Basically, what we see most every day, even on the local news broadcast, is scripted from somewhere else. There are numerous videos that you can look at on the internet where 100 different television networks from all over the United States that are independent programs on their nightly broadcast all broadcast the exact same verbiage on the exact same night. The only thing they change is the name of the town or the area that they are broadcasting from. And it doesn't matter if it's ABC, CBS, NBC, what have you. They are all broadcasting the exact same message. So truth in media has disappeared. And so if you want to know the truth, you have got to look at alternative media and you have got to do the research yourself. Because if you think you're going to watch it on CNN or Fox or any of the other mainstream medias about actually what's going on this planet and what's going on in the world, you can forget it. They don't talk about it. Because there are massive things that should be being talked about every single day, and they are not being mentioned in the media anywhere. And it's only because of myself and people like Diamond and other folks in the community that are going out and searching and getting this information and acting as a collective and bringing it together. That is the only way that we are able to learn what is actually going on. I mean, like my 9,000 hours or more is just dedicated to the grand solar minimum, and then I wanted to bring that knowledge to the public because of what I had learned and the implications of what is about to transpire on our planet, and let everybody have a fighting chance against it, as opposed to being, broadsided by it and nobody being prepared, and then it just being absolute total chaos on the planet. So, my opinion on that is educate everybody as much as you can, as quickly as you can, with as much as you can, and provide the sources where they can go and see the data and look for themselves and come to their own conclusions, as well as for them to make a plan that is best suited for their family, their situation, and their geographic location on the planet.
Yeah, this information is dangerous to our democracy, Lee.
Oh, absolutely. The number of people in the grand solar minimum community that are being blocked on Twitter and demonetized is unreal. I've got people basically sending me messages almost every day about who's being demonetized and shows being taken down, and Twitter's being deleted. Even my tweets, at Lee Wilbarger, WHEELBARGER. Even my tweets, I have tweeted something and then wanted to add additional links or what have you to that tweet, and then went to the tweet to add to it, and it said unable to respond to a deleted tweet, but yet the tweet is there. So, we're all being monitored and restricted in some way, and that is going to continue to increase in the coming days, as what we are talking about is not the narrative that the mainstream media wants.
Yeah, they're really putting the vice grips on. And once we hit 20,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, they stopped demonetizing our videos. All the videos were demonetized right when I put them up, and it took a whole day to get them monetized. And by then, all the views were gone. But once we hit 20,000 subs, they stopped demonetizing. And this has been going on for 9 weeks. It's been smooth sailing until yesterday. Yesterday's update, as soon as I started uploading it, it's in the first minute demonetized. And it stayed demonetized for 20 hours. They waited until 8,000 views until someone physically viewed it. Now, I'm happy to say that it's remonetized, yesterday's update. But just like Lee said, we're seeing the effects. Now, I've been blocked on Facebook from sharing dozens of times for up to a week or more, from commenting on anything. It's insane. I mean, it's as if I live in a third world country. I'm not allowed to comment on anything on Facebook for 10 days? Who determines that? It's absolutely nonsense. It's been going on, censorship of my work's been going on for 10 years, since I started pointing out the nonsense with Monsanto. It took them a few years to find me, but they were jamming my computer signals. I couldn't get a clean IP address. I was being followed, monitored. My organizing efforts, there was always a shill in the room. So these tactics are known and normal. But I believe that as the events unfold and the time frame we're going into, it is going to be a chokehold. As the narrative... Yeah, go ahead.
They're not going to warn us about this in advance, and all that research has already been done as to whether you do or whether you don't tell the general public. And pretty much the conclusion of this government, as well as many others, is you don't say anything until it's too late to do anything about it. And so, unless Trump or some other leaders come out and start speaking more openly about it. Now, Putin does, that's why he backed out. When Megyn Kelly went over and interviewed Putin and was talking about him backing out of the Paris Accords, for all this global warming, and he kind of looked at her with a frown on his face and goes, "What do you mean? It's cold. It's snowing, in the summertime. What are you talking about? Global warming?" Because he has a large group of scientists that have studied Valentina Zarkova's work, have studied Svensbark's work, studied John Casey's work, studied the magnetic fields themselves from the Wilcox Solar Observatory, and done the mathematical calculations, and then went back and looked at everything historically with the Rostov ice cores. Those are theirs, So they can look at all of that stuff and see what's there, and they have come to their own conclusions independent of everybody else in the world, and decided that we are going to go into this colder climate. And to show that they are aware of what's going on as far as a colder climate and the possibilities of CMEs and EMPs, just look at the new list of vehicles that they have added to their inventory within their military. They've got new wheeled vehicles that operate in the snow, new tracked vehicles. They've got all kinds of new missile launchers that operate in the snow. They're developing more. vehicles to operate in the snow. A lot more vehicles were in their Mayday parade with Arctic camouflage on it. So they're actively going forward. I mean, making oversized snowmobiles with machine guns mounted on tops of them. So 2 guys in the cab, 1 guy on the back, and you can put 6 more guys back there. So 7 in the rear, 2 in the cab, 9 guys, stroking out through the woods at 50 or 60 miles an hour, rolling across the snow. Why would a military spend millions of dollars on each of these projects to develop, the technology itself, and then to go to the point of coming up with a camo scheme of an Arctic camouflage and then implementing them within their inventory to be deployed onto the battlefield? You're talking overall, hundreds of millions of dollars when you look at all of the separate weapons packages combined. And so they know what's going on and they are preparing for it. That's why they're building barges with nuclear reactors on them. So in the event of an EMP or CME or whatever, and it takes an area out, or the temperature gets so cold that the current power generation within that region can't meet the electrical demand, they can just go upstream with one of these nuclear reactors on a barge, use the water that's around it to cool the thing, and supplement the electrical load within that region with that nuclear reactor on a barge. And then when you look at the amount of icebreakers that they're making,
I was just going to go there.
13, right. They got 13 in production right now, and I think like 5 or 6 of them are nuclear powered. These guys are going big time because they know what's going on. We got like 3 big ones, and 1 or 2 of them are in dry dock right now. So, and we've already had ice on the Hudson this past winter. That's the thickest ice for the longest amount of time in the history of keeping records of the Hudson River as far as, marine traffic going up and down. And the northeast of the United States, 90% of their fuel oil goes up the Hudson River. So what happens when that freezes and we don't have the icebreakers to open that up? How are those folks in the northeast going to keep warm? How is when the electrical demand go up with the D minus or D plus, whatever you want to grade the U.S. electrical grid with, how do you supply that demand? Because now we don't have fuel oil, so everybody's going to run out and want to plug in their electric heaters. Where's that power coming from? All the vehicles that are now going to have to be plugged in to keep them warm so people can go home at night and get up in the morning and go to work. Where's that power coming from? We don't have it. It's not in the budget. So, it's going to be a rude awakening for a lot of people when this really starts getting in, as well as losing infrastructure for, water purification facilities where we get, drinking water in cities, as well as wastewater facilities not being able to deal with the colder climate and they freeze up and overflow, as well as water mains in cities that aren't buried deep enough, and they're going to be rupturing all over the place, just like we had in Omaha, Nebraska this past winter. So, and that's happening all over. It's not just here in the United States, it's happening all over the world. So these
Nebraska,
are the things that
and all over the South. There were hundreds of thousands of water main breaks all over the South this year, and that's just going to continue to increase because they're not burying the new mains deeper. They're just replacing them.
Exactly. So, until we wake up as a nation and realize what is going on and start putting in the infrastructure that it's going to be required to deal with this coming cold climate, we're up the creek without a paddle. And so, that's why I've decided to do all these shows and spread the word and, let people know what's going on, because if you don't prepare, you're really going to be in trouble. And the signs are there. All they have to do is look and see what's going on with the sky. If you want to see what the sky is going to look like in the future, just look back at all the paintings from when they had the little ice age, and then look anytime that there's a coronal hole stream comes over the planet and look at the sunset, you'll see the same thing, the multi-layers of atmospheric compression of the layers of particles coming in, creating that nucleation in the sky. And, I've been saying this for years, and now you can see it. So, the signs are there. All you got to do is look for them. And it goes back to the old saying that I always say, and that is, people only look at what they see, and people only see what they're trained to look at. So until people come to the realization and are trained to look at these things and be able to interpret them, and have studied some of the 17 different sciences involved in the Grand Solar Minimum, once they start seeing those things, it all comes together and it's perfectly clear. And you're like, my God, how could it ever be any other way? But, it's just like trying to convince the world that it's round and not flat. I mean, that took 300 years. I'm hoping this doesn't take 30.
Well, the sciences have been disjunct since I was in university back in the 90s. The chemistry department was in a different floor than the physics department was in a different floor than the geology department. We seldom talked to each other. And back in earlier times, those natural sciences were all in the same building, yes, just like they are today, but they were also intermingling. There is such a compartmentalization of information that there is no more multidisciplinary approach. And the only approach to science is the multidisciplinary approach. If you do not approach it from all angles, you're going to miss something. And global warming science is a perfect example of missing everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of when, I used to work for DOD and all the alphabet soup agencies, and I would, roam the halls of different government facilities. And they would just bring me in on different projects. If they had wires coming out of it, I would get a phone call. So it didn't really matter, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, whomever wanted to do whatever, Special Forces or some other clandestine spooky group, I would get a call. And so I would be able to go around and play with all of the different disciplines. So, lasers, plasma, microwaves, radars, GPSs, thermal imagers, night vision equipment, different biological sensors for nuclear, biological, and chemical, and then work with the response teams and help them develop technologies to enhance their response capabilities. And so I've had the opportunity to play with all of these different technologies that are able to detect basically all of the elements that you see within the grand solar minimum. So when you look at the 17 different sciences, the sensors that detect those things are the things that I've played with for 30 years. So it makes it very easy for me to understand what's going on. And when you see something going, oh yeah, it goes that way because I've got 30 years of looking at a sensor that looks at that. So it all came together very easily for me with John Casey's research, that was the follow-on to Jack Eddy's research, and then the electric universe theory and, what Dr. Donald Scott is saying and the guys with the Sapphire Project and studying, plasma physics from the University of India. So, it all comes together once you have all the basis. And it's kind of like when I explain to, apprentices that come in and work under me, and you have to have pyramids of knowledge so as that you can expand your horizons. And I look at them as piers of a bridge. So you come out of college, you get your first little bit of knowledge, that's your first pier. Then you find something that's related to that, and you go to that and you learn that. And then you go to the next thing and you learn that. And then you're bridging that knowledge across different technologies and different sciences. And that allows you to basically go anywhere you want. But it'll take you 20 to 30 years to get there. And so once you've done that, it makes it easy to understand these things. And what I've been trying to do and helping you and all these other channels that I go on is to take all of those videos that I've seen and lectures that I've reviewed and research and so on and so forth and condense that down into basic understandable shows and then videos that I can reference and send people to so as that they can see the same things that I've seen the conclusions that these groups of scientists have come to, and then see the science behind it by the experiments, the research that's been done, the history, and I try to put everything together because it's a really big picture and a lot that you have to understand. But if you just take a little bit of it at a time, it's just like eating a camel or an elephant. You just got to do one bite at a time. So if you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and you see how they play together and then you influence it with a little bit more, it comes together pretty quickly. I've got a lot of followers who've been able to put it together, pretty quickly in about 30 days or so, and then have a really good understanding after about 90 days. So it's not really that hard, once you start studying it. You don't have to put in 9,000 hours like I did. I'm trying to give you the cheat sheet.
Yeah, and I got here from a different angle. I started in geology, paleoclimatology, Milankovitch cycles. I got interested in archaeology and personally, and then through Electric Universe, it all came together. The picture was clear, and it is definitely having access to all different, unrelated yet related sciences that gives you the big picture. And it allows you to quickly see through the fraud.
Yeah, once you have a good understanding, and you can explain it to somebody else simply, then you know what you're talking about on the subject. Because if you can't explain it simply, you don't know what you're talking about. And so, through all of my research, I just try to continue to make it as simple for people to understand and see what's going on, so as that they can determine what's best for them, and choose their path accordingly with where they are and what they have and what time they have left, as well as their financial situation.
Yeah, so if you're listening, earlier Lee said something very important, that people like him and I, we're not worried about what's going to happen because we know what's going to happen. We're preparing for what is coming. Now, the problem is, and the reason we have this show and Lee's on, is because the majority of the population is not aware. Now, Russia's well aware. They're spending billions of dollars on icebreakers that break through 15 foot of ice. The U.S. doesn't even have that capability because the world, it's global warming. Now, clearly someone knows what's up. Why would they be wasting billions of dollars on icebreakers in a global warming world? Why would the U.S. military, probably because they don't have the money, only be going with Arctic warfare? We're not going to have any wars in the Arctic. It's clear that the powers that be are well aware of what's going to happen. The 60-year war cycle, it's coming. It's coming soon. It's going to peak in the next 2.5 years. I've showed the cycle. We're going into the peak. 2021 is the war cycle peak. It also coincides with Armstrong economics analysis of the grain spike starting in 2018, spiking in 2019, peaking in 2021, with crop loss galore through the 2030s. Now we have the work of Rolf Wishy, where the sun may shut down sometime between 2024 and 2035, coupled with the waning magnetosphere. The poles may meet off of Indonesia at 2035. And this is the area, the region, where all of the major volcanic events that darken the planet occur, in this island arc system in Indonesia. We've seen uptick in that region, Mount Agung. We've had a massive earthquake there killing many tourists in Lombok. We just had a 5.0 10 minutes ago while we're doing the show. We've had major uptick on the Aleutians. We just had another 6.5 today, right near Atak volcano. We had another major quake, the largest ever recorded on the North Slope of Alaska, where the geology is flat-lying limestone. There aren't any faults. Go figure. So people like us, Lee and I, we're preparing for what we know is going to happen. And it's not for no reason. Humanity's always made it through these times. This may be a unique one, but proper prior planning will help you be more self-sufficient and resilient in these times. Times of grid failure, times of food shortage, times of war or global unrest, insanity if you're in a city. Do you have weapons? Can you defend yourself? Are you growing food? Do you have a bug-out plan? Do you have a place to go, a rural place to hide out? There's hundreds of scenarios that could happen. You don't know what they are. And Lee and I are here to provide you with a clear, concise narrative where you get the scientific facts, and then you get off of your ass on that couch and you start doing something for you and your family. And that starts with stockpiling dry goods. There's hundreds of prepping sites that you can get involved with. They're all over YouTube. And while the grid is still up, now's a good time to start. Now. Don't wait. If you live on land, you should be learning how to grow your own food, can your own food. There's a lot to learn. I've been doing it for years now. I left almost 4 years ago, and I'm just getting started. That's what I feel like. Now, I am 100 times more prepared than 99% of the population, but I have miles to go. We all do. Now, we only have about 5 minutes left. Make sure you check out Lee Wheelbarger on Twitter. Make sure you check out his Patreon page, which is going to be links below on the rebroadcast here. So click on it and make a donation. It's a monthly pledge. Just give $1, $5, $10, whatever you can afford, but stay with him. He's going to go all around the world, and it's going to be awesome. Well, North America, so to speak. He might go around the world. Who knows? If he has enough Patreons, I bet he will. Lee, do you have any helpful final words, a couple minutes on preparedness to put people's minds at ease a little bit?
Well, it's like you said, this has been survived many times before. It's a 206-year cycle. So, man has been around a whole lot longer than 206 years. The difference that we have on this particular go-around is that the civilization of the planet is not living in a pioneering lifestyle. We're not growing our own crops. We're not putting our own meat on the table. We are dependent upon an infrastructure that is going throughout the world and depending upon what's referred to as just-in-time delivery. So there are 38 major infrastructures that operate around the world. And if you damage any of those 38 major infrastructures, it is a significant economic impact to that region. The problem is that all of those 38 infrastructures are dependent upon one infrastructure, and that is electricity. And so if you take that one infrastructure away, you lose the remaining 37 infrastructures, and the results are catastrophic no matter who does the calculations. So when you go into a grand solar minimum, we are much, much more likely to be dealing with the effects of CMEs, of different demands put onto the grid because of much colder temperatures and wild temperature swings in the wrong time of the year, and detrimental storms that can tear down overhead power lines. So we have to be prepared with the ability to have power for ourselves, to be able to protect ourselves from EMPs and CMEs because of rogue actors and things of that nature, as well as natural causes from CMEs, which actually produce magnetic fields similar to that of EMPs. So these are all things that we have to prepare for, and we have to have things like water, which is the number one thing. So you need to be able to produce water coming out of the ground. You need to be able to have a windmill that produces that without power, or a hand pump and a way to bring that up. These nice filtering straws are great, but they won't last forever. And if you look at the electrical grid of the United States, and we have a substantial event of greater than an X27, say like what we had before, an X47, there won't be a grid in the United States for over a year. So if you don't have a way to make your own food, eat your own food, get your own water, heat your own house for that year or more, could be 3 years or more in all actuality, if it's a substantial CME that hits the planet. Because if it's a small CME, yeah, you might lose some countries and have substantial damage within those countries. But if you have a substantial CME that lasts, the shock waves from that reverberate our magnetosphere for days, the entire planet is going to be affected by that. And large transformers and generation systems all over the planet are going to be destroyed, as well as the controlling systems that controls those, as well as the internet. So we have to have food, beans, bullets, Band-Aids, and be prepared and go practice what you need to do to survive. Reading a book is one thing, but get out in the woods and enjoy some time with your family and friends and learn and hone the skills that you need to survive, because of the impending issues that we are all about to face.
I agree with you. We're not here to scare you. We're here to prepare you. But I assure you, technology is inedible. And when that X50 comes and the grid fails, if you can't provide for yourself, you're totally fluxed. And that's a boom. What a synopsis, Lee. There is a lot to learn, and the time to start is now. Please replay this again and again. The amount of information coming out of this episode is insane. You've got science, you got preparedness. Keep your knickers on. Don't get your panties in a bunch. This is a survivable thing. The powers that be are not going to warn you, but you can be prepared. We're talking self-resilient systems. You need a power system. You need food, dry goods. You need a way to make food. You need to know how to hunt. Start some survival skills with your family. It'll be fun. Go camping. Go fishing. Every single thing you learn is a step towards self-resilience. And in past Grand Minimas, we were a homesteading agrarian society. We knew how to provide for